All right, so I am going to do a quick overview of the large group and small group lesson plan assignment. For this assignment, you will use your lower level objective that you wrote for the Standards and Objectives project with the large group lesson and the higher level objective with the small group lesson. So you'll see in the template that both the large group lesson plan and small group lesson plan are all in the same document. So it starts with the large group lesson plan, and the name is you, that's your name. The grade is the grade that the standard that you selected. The lesson title is whatever you decide you want it to be. And then over here, you're going to include how long you think the lesson would take, keeping in mind those time limits so that we discussed, or time requirements, or that's not the word I'm looking for, suggestions, I guess, maybe, for specific age groups. So if you are doing kindergarten and it's a large group lesson and you say it's going to take 45 minutes, I'm going to say, ooh, that is not a good idea, right? Because we don't want large group lessons to be more than 15, 20 minutes at the most. So that's what goes up here. For this part, it's really easy because you're just going to cut and paste the standard, or copy and paste the standard that you used for your lessons from your Standards and Objectives project. Same here. You're just going to copy and paste the lower level objective that you wrote for the Standards and Objectives project. So you'll only, because the large group lesson is based on your lower level objective, you'll only put your lower level objective here. You also, on your Standards and Objectives assignment, identified the level of Bloom's taxonomy for the lower levels. Remember, that's either remember, understand, or apply. So here you literally just will type remember, understand, or apply. So that's all that goes in this section right here. For formative assessments, these are things that you will use to check for understanding. Remember, formative is done during the lesson to inform your teaching as you're teaching. So here you'll say, I'm going to do a checklist, I'm going to ask questions, I'm going to do a self-assessment, whatever that might be, you'll include that, what you're going to do here, and the actual assessment and description of that down here. I'm going to go through one more section and then we're going to look at an example together. All right, so then remember, summative is at the end. So the summative assessment should be something that checks to make sure that the students have met the objective. All right, so it should align directly with your objective. So this is something that at the end of the lesson you would use to make a decision about whether students met the objective or not. So again, here you'll say something like, I used a checklist, I used anecdotal records, and then in this part down here, you'll describe it in more detail and include an example. Okay, so that's kind of that first part of the large group lesson plan. So I wanted to show you an example. This is from a student from last year. So you can see here the grade level, the title, how long she thinks it will take, the standard, and the objective that she wrote. All right, so all that goes here. She included the level of Bloom's, how she was going to do a formative assessment. So she was going to do a 3-finger count. And then she describes here what that would mean, or what that might look like. Okay. For her summative assessment, she decided to do a checklist and included an example of what that checklist might look like here. Right. So that's the first part of the large group lesson plan. The next part is all about prior knowledge of your students. This may possibly be the trickiest part for all of you because you are creating this lesson plan for a hypothetical group of students. In other words, you're going to be making up this information based on your knowledge and understanding about students within the grade level that your standard is in. So I'm actually just going to look at the example for this one. I think it might be a little bit easier to get context. All right. So for this one, the student who wrote this lesson plan said, in terms of knowledge of students, this is knowledge of students related to this particular standard and objective. So this is where you can pull in from your standards and objectives assignment, that section where you said this is what I would expect students to know or have prior knowledge of. You can pull that information into this section of your lesson plan. So far, you really haven't had to do anything that you haven't already done except for the assessments. So you can pull that information directly in. Now, these next two parts, you will have to do a little bit of thinking, some creative thinking, if you will. And we're going to talk in class. So this, depending on when you watch this video, you may have already heard this or this may be new to you. But when we think about the group of students that you are designing this lesson for, I want you to think about the students having some differences, obviously, right? And so it's never going to be the case that you will have an entire classroom of students who have the exact same knowledge, skills, and abilities, right? And so you're going to have to differentiate in some way for your students. You're also more than likely going to have at least one or two students in your classroom who either have an IEP or who have or who are English language learners. And so in this section, you're going to describe how you might differentiate for your students and how you might do accommodations or modifications as well. So again, you're thinking about this hypothetical group of students. And so for differentiation, we're often thinking about how are we going to challenge the students who are kind of above the average, and how are we going to support the students who are a little below the average, right? We often develop our lessons for that kind of middle of the road group, but we don't want to leave anybody behind. We want to continue to challenge those who are ahead, but we don't want to overburden or lose the ones that are who might be struggling. So you see here that this student, when she wrote her lesson plan, wrote something about challenging the students who are more advanced and supporting the students who may need a little bit of extra assistance. So that's a good way to think about doing differentiation. You could have two ways to support students who are struggling, but I kind of like having both ends because it makes you think about both sides, those who are struggling and those who are exceeding. Under accommodations, these are more individualized types of strategies that would be used for students who have more individualized plans or needs. So again, when we're thinking about students who have an individualized education plan or IEP, those are students with disabilities who have specific things written into their IEPs that we need to address. Same for students who are English language learners. And so here you can see that the student has listed some ideas about how she might encourage students who are needing some more individualized needs and help them to provide that support. Under resources and materials, this is where you would put all of the materials and resources that that you would need to complete this lesson and where you might find those. I always say with every lesson plan, you should create it with enough detail that if someone else had to come in and teach your lesson, a sub or something else, that they would be able to do it just from reading the lesson plan. So you can see here in my comments, I tell her that in this section, I would like to see a little bit more detail. So it's great that she's thought through having the apple cutouts, having the book ready, but if I were a sub, I wouldn't know where to find these things. I wouldn't really know what to do with these things. And so a little more detail here is helpful. All right, I'm going to carry on just looking at the example because I think it's helpful to see as we're moving through. We'll kind of flip back and forth, but for the most part, we'll look at this. The next part of and we're still in the large group lesson plan here, and this is the part that you'll actually be doing. This is the part where you're describing what's actually happening in your lesson. So you'll see that there's an introduction, a middle, and a wrap up and conclusion for your lesson. Okay, so in the introduction, this is where you're going to say, how am I going to get the students' attention? How am I going to get them excited about this lesson? So that's what goes in this part. And then how am I going to link that to the rest of the lesson? All right, so here, the student who wrote this says this will take about 5 or 6 minutes. The middle of the lesson is where you're going to actually do your teaching. So how are you going to model what you want the students to do? So we use this I do, we do, you do model in our program. So I do is how am I going to model what the students are going to do? So she describes that here. We do, how are we going to work together to, and this helps me as the teacher. This might be where I'm doing a lot of my formative assessment to ask questions to make sure students understand what they're supposed to be doing. And then the you do is the more independent practice. All right. So you can see she's worked through each of these different levels, and she said that this will take approximately 10 to 11 minutes. And then finally, the end, in the wrap up and conclusion, is where we again do some checks for understanding, make sure that everybody's on the same page, summarize and go back over what we learned today. All of that kind of stuff will be in the wrap up and conclusion, and that should take just a few minutes. So even though that's technically the end of the lesson, we want to think about our next steps. So in terms of this lesson, what will be the next steps for students? How will you move them into that small group lesson, which is what's going to come after this large group lesson? Remember, large group is introducing the idea and the concept. Small group is going deeper on the same set of skills, but taking those students to a higher level of learning. So that's what this part is here. The transition's a little bit different. This is like, after this lesson, what are we going to do? All right. And so it may be that you transition directly to the small group where you learn more. It may be that they go to PE or they go to a different activity, and then you do your small group the next day. You can design this however you want to. This last part is potential for kind of like your plan B. So if something doesn't go quite right with your lesson, what are you going to do? What are some anticipated issues that you might have for the lesson, and some potential ways that you might address those issues if they come up? All right. So you can see, if I go back over to the template, all of these things are here, and you can just fill in these with the information for your specific lesson. Okay. So next, like I said, all in the same document is the small group lesson plan template as well. So just like with the large group, you're going to have your name, the grade, the lesson title, which should be, I mean, it could be the same as the large group, but usually it's a little bit different, and the anticipated time needed. Remember, in small groups, you can take a little bit more time. So again, be sure to check out that the guidelines for times for lessons, small group and large group, and include that here. This has an additional section that the large group didn't have, because for your small group lesson, you are going to be designing a small group lesson that you are leading, all right? And so I want you to think about, if you're leading a small group of, let's say, 4 or 5 students, and you have 20 students in your classroom, what are those other 19 or whatever, 15 students going to be doing while you're working with the small group? All right. It could be that they are working independently in centers. It could be that they are doing stations and they're rotating through different small groups. So that's what you'll put in this section right here. Just as before, the same standard. Remember, you're using the same standard for your large group and your small group lesson. So you're going to copy and paste that here. You're going to copy and paste your higher level objective from your standards and objectives project here. So just copy and paste your approved standard. That's what goes in this part. So you can see in the example, she's got a slightly different title. This is going to be a teacher-led small group. You see her standard and her objective. She didn't really explain what other students were going to be doing, which I didn't. I had a slightly different title. So I guess I changed that to add a little bit more detail. So I apologize for that. She's talking about the students doing something at the create level of Bloom's. She's again using this 3-finger formative assessment. You can use the same formative assessment, but you certainly could use something else as well. She's also using a checklist, but you'll see that the checklist is different. Again, you can use the same assessment, or you can change it if it makes sense for your particular lesson. All right. It should align with whatever your objective, your higher level objective is. So you can see under knowledge of students, again, you're pulling that information from the knowledge of students or what they should know from your standards and objectives assignment. And you can see here that she's got slightly different differentiation and accommodations because, again, these should align with this particular lesson and lesson objective. It is possible that they could be the same, but generally the same as your large group lesson, but generally they'll be different because you're doing something in a small group versus a large group. All right. So you can see the same format for the introduction, the link, the middle with the I do, we do, you do, the wrap up and conclusion. All right. Just like you do in the large group, you also will have next steps and transition. Next steps here might be, what are you going to do in the future, the next day, the next few days related to this topic? Transition, going into the next activity. And again, you have your plans for what would happen if something didn't go quite as you anticipated with the lesson. Okay, so again, these follow through with the template. Everything should be the same. The wording on the example and the template might be slightly different just because I edit these every semester slightly, but for the most part, they should follow the same general format. Okay, so as always, when you get ready to submit, oops, let me go back up here. Sorry, I don't have this in student view. When you get ready to submit, you will be able to go in, and for this, of course, you can submit a draft. For your draft, you can submit as much or as little as you have done on this assignment. I know that this comes up pretty quickly, and so I always encourage you to try to submit as much as you can because you can get a lot of feedback. The more feedback you have, the more likely you're going to do well in the lesson or on your lesson plans on the assignment. But I also understand that not everybody's able to do that, all right? But the information that's here in your lesson plan draft is exactly the same as it is for the assignment that's due in 2 weeks. All right, so hopefully this helped. I know it's a little longer. I always talk longer than I think I will, but I wanted to give you an overview. If you have questions about anything, please let me know, and I will see you soon.